I'm Giana Simson, 32 years old, and until recently, I was the senior policy analyst at Golden Stag Enterprises. What I'm about to tell you changed everything I thought I knew about corporate loyalty, professional respect, and my own worth in the workplace. Let me paint you a picture of who I was before this all happened. I'd been with Golden Stag for 6 years, climbing from a junior research position to senior analyst. I was the person others came to when regulations needed interpreting, when compliance frameworks needed building from scratch. My cubicle walls were covered with certificates from policy workshops, regulatory conferences, legal seminars I'd attended on weekends. While my colleagues grabbed drinks after work, I was usually hunched over case studies, dissecting legislative language until my eyes burned. The director, Carl Hutchinson, had always seemed to appreciate my thoroughness. He'd nod approvingly when I'd catch potential legal pitfalls others missed, pat my shoulder when I'd work late to perfect draft after draft. Giana's our secret weapon, he'd tell clients during presentations, while I sat quietly taking notes, ensuring every detail aligned with current regulations. But Carl was different from me in ways that became glaringly obvious as the story unfolds. Where I was meticulous, he was flashy. Where I built careful arguments backed by precedent, he painted broad strokes with confidence that sometimes masked gaps in understanding. He wore expensive suits and took long lunches with executives from other firms. I wore sensible blazers and ate salad at my desk while reviewing policy amendments. The contrast between us should have been complementary. Instead, it became the foundation of my professional nightmare. 3 months ago, Golden Stag landed the biggest client in our company's history, Meridian Tech Solutions. They needed a comprehensive regulatory compliance policy for their new data management platform. This wasn't just any policy document, it would set precedents for how tech companies handle user privacy across multiple jurisdictions. The contract was worth $2 million, and success could establish Golden Stag as the premier policy consulting firm in our region. Carl called me into his office on a Tuesday morning. The autumn sun streamed through his corner windows, illuminating dust motes that danced between us as he leaned back in his leather chair. "Giana, I've got exciting news about the Meridian project," he began, fingers steepled. "This is our chance to really showcase what Golden Stag can deliver." My pulse quickened. I'd been preparing for weeks, researching similar cases, building frameworks that could handle the complex intersections of federal privacy laws, state regulations, and international compliance requirements. "I'd like you to take the lead on the technical research," he continued. "Really dive deep into the regulatory landscape, build out our knowledge base. It's crucial work." "Of course," I replied, already mentally organizing my approach. "When do we start collaborative drafting sessions?" Carl's smile shifted slightly, becoming what I now recognize as patronizing. "Actually, I'll be handling the primary drafting myself. We want a cleaner perspective on this one, something that speaks directly to C-suite executives without getting bogged down in technical minutiae." The words hit me like ice water. Cleaner perspective? My 6 years of specialized expertise, my weekend conferences, my reputation for catching legal landmines reduced to technical minutiae that needed cleaning? I stayed silent, nodding as if this made perfect sense, even as confusion and hurt churned in my stomach. Carl continued talking about timelines and deliverables, but his words became background noise to my racing thoughts. Walking back to my desk, I felt hollow. Colleagues smiled and waved, unaware that I'd just been systematically excluded from the most important project of my career. The irony wasn't lost on me, they wanted my research but not my perspective, my expertise but not my voice. Over the following days, I threw myself into the technical research with determined professionalism. If I couldn't shape the policy directly, I'd make sure Carl had every piece of information he needed to succeed. I compiled comprehensive regulatory summaries, created detailed compliance matrices, analyzed case law precedents until my desk looked like a law library explosion. Carl would swing by periodically, scanning my work with quick nods. "Great stuff, Giana. Really thorough as always." Then he'd disappear back into his office, door closed, presumably crafting the policy draft that would carry Golden Stag's reputation. I told myself this was normal corporate hierarchy. Director's draft, analyst's research. But late at night, staring at my bedroom ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in how Carl viewed my contributions. 2 weeks later, Carl submitted the first draft to Meridian's legal team. He seemed confident, almost cocky, during our team meeting the next morning. "I think we've delivered something really special here," he announced to our gathered department. "Clean, executive-focused, free of unnecessary complexity. This is the kind of strategic thinking that sets Golden Stag apart." His words stung, each one a subtle dismissal of the detailed, nuanced approaches I'd always championed. But I smiled and nodded, playing the supportive team member while my professional identity crumbled quietly inside. 3 days passed. Carl maintained his confident demeanor, already talking about follow-up projects with Meridian, potential expansions of our contract. He scheduled a celebratory lunch with senior management, discussing how this success would position him for the vice president role that had recently opened up. Then came Friday afternoon. I was reviewing quarterly compliance updates when Carl's office door exploded open. He stormed out, face flushed, tie askew, looking like a man whose entire world had just collapsed. "Why is legal tearing it apart?" he screamed, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. The office fell silent. Keyboards stopped clicking. Phone conversations paused mid-sentence. Carl stood in the middle of our workspace, holding printed pages that looked like they'd been marked up with a particularly aggressive red pen. "Giana," he barked, spinning toward my desk. "Get in my office. Now." My hands trembled slightly as I gathered my notepad, walking past colleagues whose eyes followed me with mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Carl's office door slammed behind us with finality that made my stomach clench. "They're saying the entire framework is fundamentally flawed," he continued, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. "Regulatory gaps, compliance oversights, potential liability exposures. How is this possible?" I studied the marked-up pages he thrust at me. Meridian's legal team hadn't just found minor issues, they'd identified systematic problems with the policy's basic structure. Missing federal requirements, state law conflicts, international compliance gaps that could expose the company to massive fines. These were exactly the kinds of complex, technical issues I'd spent years learning to navigate. The kinds of problems my research had anticipated and my excluded perspective could have prevented. The technical research was solid, I said carefully, choosing my words like steps through a minefield. But policy drafting requires integrating that research with regulatory interpretation and compliance strategy. Carl stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "Are you saying this is my fault?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications about blame, competence, and the professional relationship we'd built over 6 years. I could have said yes. I could have pointed out that excluding me from drafting sessions had created exactly this scenario. I could have highlighted how my technical minutiae might have prevented this disaster. Instead, I said, "I'm saying we need to completely restructure the framework before resubmission." What followed were the longest 2 weeks of my career. Carl and I worked 18-hour days, rebuilding the policy from the ground up. But our dynamic had fundamentally changed. He no longer dismissed my input as overly technical. Instead, he hung on every regulatory interpretation, every compliance nuance I provided. The irony was bitter. My expertise, suddenly essential for salvaging his mistake, had always been available. The cleaner perspective he'd wanted had nearly cost Golden Stag its biggest client and his own professional reputation. During those late nights in the office, I began to understand something crucial about my own value. I'd spent years seeking validation from people who fundamentally misunderstood what I brought to the table. Carl's initial dismissal wasn't about my capabilities, it was about his insecurities and limited understanding of what complex policy work actually required. The revised policy passed Meridian's legal review with minor suggestions rather than systematic red marks. Carl presented it to senior management as a collaborative effort, carefully avoiding mention of the near disaster his solo approach had created. But something had broken inside me during this process. Not my confidence in my abilities, that had actually grown stronger. What broke was my willingness to accept professional diminishment from people who couldn't recognize expertise when it sat right in front of him. I started updating my resume that weekend. Not out of anger or spite, but from a clear-eyed recognition that I deserved better than an environment where my contributions were valued only in crisis mode. The job search took 3 months. I was selective, looking for organizations that understood the strategic importance of regulatory expertise. I interviewed with companies that asked detailed questions about my policy development experience, where senior executives understood the difference between surface-level compliance and deep regulatory strategy. I accepted an offer from Clearwater Consulting as their Director of Regulatory Affairs, a promotion in both title and responsibility, with a salary increase that reflected the true market value of my expertise. My last day at Golden Stag was surprisingly emotional. Colleagues who'd witnessed Carl's meltdown approached me throughout the day, some sharing their own stories of being undervalued, others expressing genuine sadness about my departure. Carl himself was notably absent during my farewell interactions. No goodbye lunch, no acknowledgement of the 6 years I'd contributed to his department's success. His silence spoke volumes about his character and his ongoing inability to confront the professional failures this experience had revealed. The personal growth that accompanied this professional transformation surprised me most. The confidence I'd developed in client meetings began spilling over into other areas of my life. I started setting boundaries with people who'd previously taken advantage of my accommodating nature. I negotiated a better lease on my apartment. I even had difficult conversations with family members who'd grown accustomed to my unconditional availability for their problems. Alex noticed the change immediately. "You walk differently now," he observed one evening as we prepared dinner together. "Like you take up the space you're entitled to instead of apologizing for existing." He was right. Years of professional diminishment had trained me to minimize myself, to defer to others even when I possessed superior knowledge or experience. Success at Clearwater had reminded me that expertise deserved acknowledgement, that competence earned respect, that my voice had value beyond what others were willing to grant it. The relationship between Alex and me grew stronger through this period, but not without challenges. My increased travel for client meetings and conference presentations required adjustments we hadn't anticipated. Some evenings, I'd return from presenting to corporate boards feeling energized and accomplished, only to find Alex feeling disconnected from this evolving version of who I was becoming. "Sometimes I feel like I'm dating a stranger," he admitted during one particularly honest conversation. "Not because you've changed in bad ways, but because you're becoming someone I never got to meet before." The confident, assertive Giana was always there, but she was hidden under layers of professional disappointment. We worked through it with patience and communication, but his observation highlighted something crucial about my Golden Stag experience. The environment hadn't just limited my professional growth, it had suppressed fundamental aspects of my personality. I'd learned to be small, accommodating, grateful for minimal recognition instead of expecting appropriate acknowledgement. Recovery from that kind of systematic diminishment takes time and conscious effort. I had to relearn how to advocate for myself, how to present ideas with confidence rather than apologetic uncertainty, how to accept compliments without immediately deflecting them. The financial impact of my career transition was significant in ways I hadn't initially calculated. The salary increase at Clearwater was substantial, but the secondary benefits were even more valuable. I was earning speaking fees for conference presentations, consulting revenue from individual client projects, and building the kind of professional network that creates long-term career opportunities. For the first time since college, I felt financially secure enough to make choices based on interest rather than necessity. I enrolled in executive education courses at the business school downtown, not because my job required it, but because I wanted to expand my strategic thinking capabilities. I traveled to regulatory conferences in other countries, building international perspectives on compliance challenges. Most importantly, I started contributing to my retirement accounts at the maximum allowable levels, something I'd never been able to afford during my Golden Stag years despite working there for 6 years. The difference in compensation between environments that value expertise and those that merely tolerate it was staggering. 18 months after leaving Golden Stag, I received an unexpected LinkedIn message from Carl Hutchinson. The message was brief, professionally cordial, and completely self-serving. "Giana, hope you're well. Golden Stag is bidding on a project that could benefit from your regulatory expertise. Would you be interested in discussing a consulting arrangement?" I stared at the message for several minutes, processing the audacity and the irony in equal measure. The man who'd excluded me from the most important project of my tenure, who'd nearly destroyed our client relationship through his dismissive approach to my expertise, was now reaching out to purchase that same expertise at consulting rates that would cost Golden Stag triple my former salary. My response was polite but firm. "Carl, thank you for thinking of me. Unfortunately, my consulting schedule is fully booked for the foreseeable future. Best of luck with your project." I didn't mention that Clearwater's policy prevented us from taking contracts that might create conflicts of interest with existing clients. I didn't explain that my expertise was now reserved for organizations that had valued it from the beginning rather than discovered it during crises. I simply declined and moved forward. The satisfaction of that moment was profound, not because I'd refused to help someone who'd wronged me, but because I'd reached a point where my expertise was sufficiently valued that I could choose my professional engagements based on strategic fit rather than desperate availability. 2 years later, I was promoted to Senior Director of Regulatory Strategy at Clearwater, overseeing a department of 12 specialists and managing client relationships worth over $8 million annually. The promotion came with equity participation in the firm, transforming me from employee to part owner of the business I was helping to build. During my promotion announcement, Dr. Mills made a comment that captured everything about the journey I traveled. Giana joined us with exceptional technical expertise, but what makes her invaluable is her ability to translate complex regulatory requirements into strategic business advantages. She doesn't just help clients comply with regulations, she helps them leverage regulatory knowledge as a competitive differentiator. That perspective, regulatory expertise as strategic asset rather than necessary burden, represented the fundamental difference between organizations that unlock potential and those that constrain it. At Golden Stag, my knowledge had been treated as specialized technical support. At Clearwater, it became the foundation for client relationships worth millions of dollars. The industry recognition that followed my promotion exceeded anything I'd imagined during those dark nights rebuilding Carl's failed policy. I was invited to join the editorial board of Regulatory Strategy Quarterly, the industry's most prestigious publication. The International Association of Compliance Professionals asked me to keynote their annual conference. 3 different universities reached out about guest lecturing opportunities in their graduate programs. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source, a junior analyst at Golden Stag named Michelle Torres, who reached out through a professional networking event. "You probably don't remember me," she began, "but I was part of your department when you left. I wanted you to know that watching you stand up for your expertise and then succeed so dramatically gave me the courage to advocate for myself. I just accepted a position as Senior Policy Analyst at Morrison & Associates, with a 40% salary increase and direct client contact from day one." Michelle's message reminded me that professional courage has ripple effects beyond our individual circumstances. When we refuse to accept diminishment, when we insist on recognition for our expertise, when we choose environments that value our contributions appropriately, we create examples that inspire others to demand better for themselves. The transformation in my professional identity was complete, but the personal growth continued. I'd learned to recognize my worth independent of external validation, but more importantly, I'd developed the strength to insist that others recognize it too. I no longer accepted situations where my expertise was treated as optional rather than essential. This newfound assertiveness created unexpected challenges in my personal relationships. My parents, particularly my mother, had grown accustomed to my previous accommodating nature. When I started declining family obligations that conflicted with important client meetings, or when I stopped automatically volunteering to handle everyone else's bureaucratic problems, some family members interpreted this as selfishness rather than healthy boundary setting. "You've changed since you got that fancy job," my mother said during a tense phone conversation after I declined to spend my weekend helping my cousin navigate an insurance dispute. "You used to care about family." The accusation stung because it revealed how my previous people-pleasing behavior had been mistaken for genuine care rather than recognized as the people-pleasing it actually was. Learning to differentiate between authentic helpfulness and compulsive accommodation became an ongoing process that extended far beyond my professional life. Alex and I decided to move in together properly during my second year at Clearwater. We'd been practically living together anyway, but making it official felt like acknowledging that we'd both grown through my career transition. He'd learned to support an ambitious partner whose work demanded travel and irregular hours, while I'd learned to maintain intimate relationships while pursuing demanding professional goals. Our apartment search revealed another dimension of my transformation. Instead of focusing primarily on affordability and convenience, as I had throughout my Golden Stag years, I found myself considering factors like home office space, proximity to the airport for client travel, and neighborhood prestige that might affect client perceptions during virtual meetings. "You're thinking like an executive now," Alex observed as we toured a downtown loft with harbor views and a dedicated study. "Not just someone who works for executives." He was right. My self-concept had fundamentally shifted from employee to professional leader. This wasn't arrogance or pretension, it was the natural result of operating in an environment where my judgment was trusted, my expertise was valued, and my contributions were recognized as strategic rather than merely tactical. The apartment we chose reflected this evolution. It was in a building where other residents included senior professionals, entrepreneurs, and consultants whose careers demanded sophisticated presentation capabilities. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I belonged in an environment of accomplished professionals rather than aspiring to eventually reach their level. The third year at Clearwater brought opportunities one couldn't have imagined during my Golden Stag years. Dr. Mills approached me about leading the firm's expansion into environmental regulatory consulting, a rapidly growing market as companies faced increasing pressure around sustainability compliance. "We want you to build this practice from the ground up," she explained during our quarterly review meeting. "Hire your own team, develop service offerings, establish client relationships. Essentially, become the founding partner for environmental regulatory services." The opportunity was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. I'd spent my career as a subject matter expert contributing to other people's visions. Now I was being asked to create and lead my own vision within the broader Clearwater framework. The environmental regulatory landscape was complex in ways that excited rather than intimidated me. Carbon offset regulations, renewable energy compliance, waste management requirements, environmental impact assessments, these weren't just technical requirements to be navigated, but strategic business considerations that could provide competitive advantages for forward-thinking companies. Building the environmental practice required skills I'd never fully developed at Golden Stag. I had to create marketing materials, develop pricing strategies, build relationships with industry associations, and recruit talented professionals who would want to join a startup practice within an established firm. The recruiting process was particularly revealing. As I interviewed potential team members, I found myself articulating a vision for regulatory consulting that went far beyond what I'd experienced at Golden Stag. I talked about regulatory expertise as business strategy, compliance frameworks as competitive differentiators, and regulatory professionals as essential strategic advisors rather than necessary cost centers. My first hire was Dr. Samuel Chen, a former EPA regulator whose PhD in environmental engineering was complemented by an MBA and 5 years of private sector consulting experience. During his final interview, he asked a question that captured everything I'd learned about professional environments: "What's your philosophy about the relationship between technical expertise and client engagement?" My answer came naturally: technical expertise without client engagement is just expensive research. Client engagement without technical expertise is just expensive conversation. The magic happens when deep technical knowledge becomes the foundation for strategic business relationships. Sam accepted our offer over 2 competing positions at larger firms, specifically citing our commitment to involving technical experts directly in client relationship management and strategic planning. The environmental practice launch exceeded our most optimistic projections. Within 18 months, we'd secured contracts with 12 major corporations, hired 6 additional specialists, and generated over $3 million in revenue. More importantly, we'd established Clearwater as a recognized leader in environmental regulatory strategy, with speaking invitations at sustainability conferences and requests for commentary on proposed environmental legislation. The success brought unexpected personal satisfaction. I wasn't just applying my expertise, I was creating environments where other regulatory professionals could thrive in ways I'd never been allowed to at Golden Stag. When junior team members presented directly to clients, when their technical insights shaped strategic recommendations, when their expertise was recognized and valued from their first day, I felt like I was healing not just my own professional wounds but creating better experiences for the next generation of regulatory specialists. The irony wasn't lost on me that Carl Hutchinson, who'd sought a cleaner perspective by excluding my input, had ultimately taught me the most valuable lesson of my career: the difference between organizations that unleash potential and those that constrain it. His dismissive approach had forced me to discover my own worth and insist that others recognize it appropriately. During industry events, I occasionally encountered former Golden Stag colleagues who would update me on the company's continued struggles with client retention and project management. The cultural problems that had enabled my mistreatment weren't isolated incidents, they were systematic issues that continued affecting other talented professionals who deserved better. "You were smart to leave when you did," Patricia told me during a recent conference. "The new leadership is better, but they're still dealing with the reputation damage from the Meridian situation and several other near misses that followed similar patterns." These conversations reinforced my conviction that professional environments matter as much as individual capabilities. Talented people can struggle in toxic cultures while thriving in supportive ones. The difference isn't just about immediate job satisfaction, it's about long-term career trajectory, personal growth, and the development of confidence that enables even greater achievement. Meanwhile, I was thriving at Clearwater. My first major project involved developing regulatory frameworks for 3 Fortune 500 companies simultaneously. My new colleagues treated my expertise as the strategic asset it had always been, involving me in client presentations, seeking my input on business development, recognizing policy development as the complex, high-value work it actually represents. The professional growth I experienced in those 6 months exceeded what I'd achieved in my final 3 years at Golden Stag. When you're valued appropriately, when your contributions are recognized and utilized effectively, your capabilities expand in ways you never expected.